Welcome back to the next session. We are about almost ready to get started. If you are here already, please mute your microphones. We have our keynote speaker, Professor John Williams, with us. He is about ready, and I'll turn my
recording in progress.
I'll turn my microphone to the next MC. Are you ready, Ajahn James? Ajahn James.
ครับผมก็
I'll turn the stage on you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back for afternoon sessions. First, I would like to make announcements for the activities during this afternoon. So we're gonna have three parts. The first one, we're gonna have our partner keynote speaker. He will be the second keynote speaker for today, Professor Dr. John Williams, and his session will start from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And the second activities from 2 o'clock to 3:50 o'clock will be parallel sessions, which you can go use the link as you follow the link from the conference website in the morning. And the third part is from 4 to 5 o'clock will be a panelist session. And for right now, I think it's almost time, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Williams, here with us. And if give me a second. Oh, okay. Yep. So Professor Williams sent me a message. Okay, about if the audience have questions. Yeah, feel free to keep your question at the end of the presentation, or if you want to send your question in the chat box, that's okay too. Yeah. And right now, I would like to give you a brief introduction about Dr. Williams. Professor Dr. John Williams is a professor of education and the director of graduate research in the School of Education at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. And he teaches and supervises research students in STEM and technology education. Apart from Australia, he has worked and studied in a number of African and Indian Ocean countries, and in New Zealand and the United States. And his current research interest in STEM and mentoring beginning teachers, PCK, and electronic assessment of performance. And he regularly presents at international and national conferences, consult on technology education in a number of countries, and is a long-standing member of 8 professional associations. He is the editor of the Springer Contemporary Issues in Technology Education series, and is on the editorial board of 6 professional journals. He has authors contribute to over 250 publications, and is elected to the International Technology and Engineering Education Association's Academy of Fellows for prominence in the profession. And Dr. Williams' presentation will talk about the evolution of new paradigms on current trends in education related to pedagogy, curriculum, and how teachers work. And ladies and gentlemen, please give a virtual applause to Dr. Williams.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your kind welcome. It's very nice to see some friendly faces and names I recognize. in the audience today. So it's a real pleasure to be able to chat with you for a little while this afternoon. I'd like to thank the conference organisers for their invitation. I still hold hope that we can soon meet face to face and have these discussions face to face, but not just yet, apparently. Maybe later this year, we're hoping that will be the case. So let me just share my my presentation. So does that look okay?
It's still in the program screen. It's not presentation mode yet.
You need to click on the slideshow.
Yeah, I've just done that. I've got multiple screens is the problem.
The screen is frozen, John. Could you try go to the slide share or the bottom? Yeah, it looks like it is clicked on.
And having some comments and some discussions afterwards. I've taken my title today from the title of the conference. And while my focus in some regards will be on technology education and to some extent teacher education, I think many of the comments I want to make will be quite generalizable. So because my background is technology education, that's where I'm coming from. But hopefully you'll find something in this discussion which will be relevant to your particular area. So the outline of what I'd like to talk about is, first of all, chat about what might be some of the rationales for new paradigms. If we think about new ways of teaching and new forms of education, what's the rationale for doing that? What's the reason for doing that? Then I would like to remind you a little bit about the nature of technology education. Then I'll talk about some of the opportunities that are taking place that will enhance, I think, new directions in education. I'll then suggest some elements of what might constitute new paradigms, and I'm very pleased that some of my comments are well aligned with Professor Clark's presentation this morning. So I think we're on the same page here, which is nice. And I'll conclude with what I perceive as some limitations to new ways of doing teacher education. Okay, next slide. Okay, so first of all, why would we have new paradigms? And I think there's probably 6 reasons that I can think of, which I would like to run through. And these are not new to you. You're aware of each of these difficulties and dilemmas that we have, but in the context that I'm presenting them, I want to relate them to education and to teacher training. So many of you will be aware of the IPCC report that came out about a month ago. It quite clearly indicated that we are really on the edge of irrevocable change in terms of climate. So the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of our planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So if that's not a rationale to do something differently, then I don't know what is. If we could go to the next slide, which is a picture from New South Wales, one of the states in Australia, taken a couple of weeks ago. And these two pictures are actually of the same location. So you can see the left, the height of the McDonald's sign, and then 3 days later, you can see the height of the floodwater compared with the McDonald's sign. So many people are struggling, and this is just one instance in one country. But as the IPCC report points out, these types of impacts and effects are going to continue and to be more prevalent. Okay, next slide. The next thing we need to keep in mind, I think, as a rationale for a new paradigm and a new way of doing things is the poverty that still exists in the world. I mean, I think this is an indicator that what we have done in the past hasn't worked. So there's still 690 million people living on less than $2 a day in the world. 1 in 4 of the world's population live on less than $3.20 US a day. So even though over time there's been a global decrease in poverty levels, which is a good thing, it's been a very inequitable decrease. So it hasn't affected all countries in the same way. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the effect of the most recent difficulty that we've all had to deal with in terms of COVID. So the 3 graphs represent 2018, 2019, and 2020. You can see that in 2018 and 2019, there was a continuing decrease in extreme poverty globally, but 2020, and I suspect 2021 and 22 will be similar, that COVID has exacerbated the extreme poverty. So if there's a need for change, this would tend to indicate that that need is becoming more significant and more urgent as time goes on. The next slide, I look at the third point that I think is relevant in terms of a rationale for a relook at what we do, and that's global inequality. And here I focus on education, inequality in education. In low-income countries, adult literacy is only 55%. 1 in 4 youth are not literate. 3/5 of all students who should be in school are not in secondary schools, and 250 million children are not in primary schools when they should be and could be. So what we've been doing in the past hasn't addressed this particular level of inequality. And if we go to the next slide, we see another aspect of inequality, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that's related to income and wealth. So the graphs on the left-hand side are related to income. The blue graph is the bottom 50% of the world's population, and the red graph is the top 10% of the world's population. So you can see that for income, and even more so for wealth, it's really an unsustainable balance, that 50% of the world's population should only have 2% of the wealth, and the top 10% have 76% of the world's wealth. So these inequalities are particularly problematic as we look towards global development. Okay, my next slide is the fourth reason I think there's a rationale for looking at new paradigms. And that's what we've come to call the digital divide. The technological transformation of society. And as educators, particularly in a time of COVID, of course, we're so dependent on technology for our delivery of education and our interaction with our students. But also, even when we try and do that, we realize the divide there is amongst even our students, let alone globally. So technology has really provided opportunities for transformation in many different ways. But the problem is that the technological developments have mostly been used to advance business objectives. And we don't have to look beyond the commonalities of Facebook and Twitter to see the self-serving nature of these technological developments. Underprivileged groups are routinely excluded from the advances in technology, which we're all coming to depend on more and more. So this digital divide is becoming more acute. And this is evidenced by the next slide, where we can see country groups of capability access. So the graphs measure, the line graphs measure the number of countries in different categories. So the red line is low-income countries. The blue line is high-income countries. And you can see the extent to which the divide has developed since 2005. So whatever we're doing is not diminishing the digital divide. So again, I think it's another opportunity to look at what we can do better. Someone has their microphone on, maybe you could turn it off, thanks. The next slide deals with some quite current world events, which I think are possibly trends in the world order. Different organizations have referred to this in different ways. It's really representing a diminishing of democratic governments and a rise in exclusionary government, where the people have less of a say in the nature of government. So the online site VDem termed this a transition from electoral democracy to autocracy. The Freedom House group referred to this shift as from free to partly free political systems. The Economist has termed this move a shift from full to flawed democracies. So this is a trend that concerns many people, and yet it's still happening. So our question is, what can we do about this in terms of education? And I ask you to think about current events. For example, what if Putin succeeds in what he's trying to do in Ukraine? And there's a chance of that happening. What if Donald Trump gets re-elected? What if other countries annex previously independent countries? This shifting world order has been a number of years in the making, but it seems at the moment it's at a critical stage. And I think, again, cause for us to reflect on how education should relate to this. How can we prepare our students for various types of futures? My final idea on the next slide is also something that you're all familiar with, and that is the future of work. So we know that jobs are changing. If we could just go back again. Thank you. Maybe I'm trying to be rushed here. Are you trying to rush me? The future of work. So, and it's now the case in employment that even if you have a good job, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't live in poverty. So there's 300 million people in the world who are engaged in paid work, but nevertheless still live in poverty. Within this, there's of course youth and gender discrepancies. So young people are more likely to be unemployed, and as you know, differences between male and female remuneration for employment remains a significant obstacle. We're aware of technological advances, so we know there's going to be new jobs and there's going to be displacement of current workers. Also, the move towards the greening of the economy. We notice this in Australia. If I can talk from my perspective, we've got a lot of coal mines and many of them are starting to be shut down. So there's a lot of workers who are looking for new jobs. But renewable energies is a quickly developing area. So transitioning that employment complexity is something that I think our students need to be aware of. So those ideas, I think, represent why it's appropriate at this time that we think about possible new paradigms or elements of paradigms as teachers for our work with our students and in the training of teachers as well. So my next slide, please. So I want to just remind you of the nature of technology education for a moment, because this is the context in which I'm going to put this. My background, of course, is technology education, so it's very hard for me not to be self-promotional. So this is a little bit of talking about the nature of technology education. And I've just got a couple of slides to develop this idea. So if I could go to the next slide. This really summarizes what technology education is. So it's students using design thinking to generate and produce design solutions for authentic needs and opportunities. So that's the summary of the nature of technology education. So students make things. So students are active. They're actively engaged in their learning. They think about what they're making. They're encouraged to be creative in their thinking and planning. And what they're doing, the problems that they're solving, are relevant and authentic. So relevant and authentic to them, not to us as teachers, but to the students themselves. So these are the goals of technology education. And I know a number of these ideas are common across other discipline areas as well. The next slide indicates that the goal of technology education is technological literacy. And when we look at the elements of technological literacy, I think it makes clear the relationship between thinking about new paradigms, dealing with the issues that we have, and education itself. So a technologically literate person will recognize the pervasiveness of technology in everyday life. They will know that all technologies entail some risk, and only some of which can be anticipated. So new technologies don't always achieve what the designer intended. There's often unintended consequences to new technology. A technological literate person will understand that technology reflects the values and culture of a society. So technology develops according to the needs and wishes of a particular society. So there's a real relationship between development, technology, and use of technology between the technology and the society. And a more personal element of technological literacy is that a literate person can use a design thinking process to solve a problem that they encounter in daily life. So there's a notion of transferability or generalizability of the recognizing the nature of a problem and developing a series of actions to address that particular problem. So that's all I'm going to say about technology education, but I think it puts this discussion in a particular context, which I'd like us to relate the various issues to. So if we could go to the next slide. There's a number of things developing within education and with society, which I think represent opportunities, one, for technology education, so for the development of this particular curriculum, but again, as I said before, I think for a more broad relevance to other areas of education. So I'm just going to run through a couple of those opportunities. The next slide, thanks. And you'll all be familiar, I'm sure, with the development of makerspaces. There's many countries in Southeast Asia which are really at the forefront, I think, of international developments in looking at makerspaces in terms of education. Now, from a technology education perspective, there's some real similarities between the goals and the elements of makerspaces and technology education. So in a makerspace, a student or a person will be designing something. They'll be working in a way that's personally relevant to them. And that's something that we'd like to see in education. What they're doing is relevant to them as an individual. Usually it's a creative process, and the people who are working in makerspaces have ownership over what they're doing. So many of these characteristics are what we would like to see in our classrooms and in student engagement. So I think this makerspace movement offers opportunities for different forms of education. The next opportunity, I think, is related to the development of engineering, not so much as a curriculum area, but a recognition that engineering has relevance in terms of education. And many countries I know, like Taiwan and Thailand and Vietnam, are coming to look at the engineering design process as something that enables teachers to make learning relevant to students. So design is a commonality between engineering and technology. And in some countries, engineering is becoming part of the curriculum together with technology to enhance those two areas, and particularly the practical and the design related elements, so that students are engaged in active learning. My next opportunity relates significantly to Professor Clark's presentation earlier today, where he summarized the great movements that have occurred throughout civilization, and the most recent we could term a movement towards a knowledge economy. We see in much educational literature discussion about the relevance of the 4 C's and the notion of 21st century skills. I think we need to stop talking about 21st century skills now that we're well into the 21st century. But nevertheless, it's a term that people have commonly come to recognize. And these elements of a focus on critical thinking, communication, collaboration between students, and that relates again to what Professor Clark was talking about this morning in terms of the emergence paradigm and collaboration being an important element of that. And then students being creative as well. So these attributes that we would like to see in our students relate clearly to the area of technology, but also they're becoming more common in terms of many curriculum areas. The next slide, again, is something that you're all very familiar with. In fact, some of us had a discussion just yesterday across a number of countries related to the development of STEM. I think this approach is particularly significant because of its recognition of the need for interdisciplinarity. I'll talk a little bit later about one of the impediments towards moving to new paradigms. And one, I think, is the discipline structure that our curriculum is lumbered with. So I think a significant aspect of a STEM approach is the need for interdisciplinarity, and also its focus on realism. Its focus on engaging students in real activities, problems that are real to them. I think that's a significant element that we can all learn from. And then my final opportunity, I think, and also Professor Clark alluded to this, what's come to be termed Industry 4.0. And what's significant here, I think, is the developing interconnectedness between everything that we do. Again, this is related to technological development because it's technology that's enabling all these links to take place. So it's powered by technology, and people like myself would say, therefore, we need a stronger form of technology education because of this all-pervasiveness of technology as it's developing in society. Okay, my next slide. So let me now get, I suppose, to the point of the presentation and look at some not new paradigms, but I think elements which contribute to new paradigms in education. So we've looked at a rationale, why we need new paradigms. I've been a little bit self-serving in saying that technology education is one mechanism for engaging with this. There's lots of opportunities for that. And now, what might be some of the activities that as teachers we can look at which would enable new paradigms in pedagogy, curriculum, and technology. So my next slide, I begin with pedagogy. And I'd like to preface this discussion by reminding you that paradigm changes are not revolutionary, but they're evolutionary. And I think, again, Professor Clark mentioned this morning, that the period of time it takes for a new approach to education to be recognized as a paradigm takes some time, and also takes a number of people to recognize that this is a new approach. So I guess what I'm trying to do is indicate that these are some areas that we should look at, which maybe would enable new paradigms in education, because what we've done in the past really hasn't worked very well. So I think our pedagogies that we use in our classrooms should be collaborative, interdisciplinary, and problem posing. So collaborative, where we're tending to move away from teacher-centered instruction to student-centered learning. But even that isn't necessarily collaborative. By collaboration, we mean teachers, we mean students, we mean the community. A broader collaborative endeavor. And if education is going to be realistic for students, then our pedagogies have to be interdisciplinary. Many of the world's big problems, well, I would say all of the world's big problems require interdisciplinary solutions. So I think our pedagogy should mirror that. Something quite specific, as an example, problem-based learning, for example, does not diminish the need for knowledge. Often I hear teachers say, well, I can't do inquiry learning, or I can't do a design problem because I've got a curriculum I have to get through, which is crowded with knowledge that I've got to get across to my students. That's a false dichotomy. Focusing on active learning does not diminish the need for disciplinary understanding. So I think our mentality has to dissolve that, possible discrepancy. We also need to use our pedagogy to help students see the world as changeable rather than fixed. So inequity, the digital divide, climate issues, all of these at the moment remain reversible. And our students need to recognize that if they play a role in the social development of understanding, then some of these trends can be reversed. So my next slide. we need a pedagogy which values and sustains diversity. I mean, some of us teach in very homogeneous types of classrooms. So the one type of student, or in teacher training, we don't have a particularly diverse population that we're dealing with. So that doesn't absolve us from the need to recognize the significant diversity. And related to that, addressing the racism, the sexism, the colonialism, and the authoritarianism that seems to increasingly exist in some aspects of society. So our pedagogies also need to provide students with the opportunity to unlearn maybe some prejudices and some divisions that they already have, and maybe they don't recognize that they have this unexpressed prejudice, for example. So my next slide, please, which is my final few ideas on pedagogy. Assessment, I think, is a real impediment to useful and relevant pedagogy. As teachers, we need to recognize that some of the goals that we have can be measured and some can't be measured. Just because an educational goal can't be measured doesn't mean that it's not important, and doesn't mean that we should not have it as a goal of what we do in our classroom. Our focus on only including goals which can be assessed is an outcome of some neoliberal elements that we face as teachers in educational systems today, that everyone needs to be accountable, everyone needs to be assessed. We need to reverse that notion. We need to reject that idea. Maybe some goals that we have, even though they can't be quantified, they can be observed. I mean, we think of, for example, a common goal that we have in our classes is that we want our students to be more collaborative, to work better together, to know how to share diverse opinions. It's quite difficult to quantify that, but as a teacher, you can observe it. So it's an important goal that we should not do away with just because we can't quantify it. And in terms of assessment, I think it's a real impediment to forward education. The competition which exists within education, particularly in relation to high stakes testing. It's very difficult, and it's, in a sense, it's not fair for teachers not to teach to the test when the tests are such high stakes. So the teachers are in an invidious position in that context. So it's something, again, that we need to work against. So my next slide presents a couple of ideas related to curriculum, which I think we need to focus on if our education is going to be relevant. And this is an idea I've already mentioned a little. Content does not compete with processes and competencies. We need to develop systems of curriculum and then related pedagogy, as I've already mentioned, where content is sympathetic to process and the competencies that we want to develop with our students. This is a whole picture. This is a holistic approach. These are not separate elements, the processes we engage in, the competencies we want our students to develop, the content that we're told is important. we need to meld these together. And in that way, I think we are better able to respond to the big issues like climate change, for example. Neuroscience indicates, and this is related to this holistic idea, neuroscience indicates that knowing and feeling are part of the same cognitive process. So if we just focus on knowing without addressing feeling, then we're developing impediments for the effectiveness of our own education. So we have to address, again, the holistic nature. Students feel and know, and they don't do those things separately. So if our students aren't feeling comfortable, if they're not feeling good, then their knowing and their learning and their education will be affected. So my next slide. In this slide, I want to focus particularly on the nature of literacy, and partly because in an Australian context, literacy has become quite a narrow concept of reading and writing. School students are tested every year. It's a compulsory national test that students do to determine this very narrow aspect or narrow interpretation of literacy. And so, of course, teachers focus on that, because if their students don't do well in the national test, then it reflects on their school and it reflects on them. So the notion of literacy, I think we need to broaden and have the curriculum address that breadth of literacy. So it should encompass critical literacy. Of course, we're not imparting a particular type of literacy. We're developing students' critical literacies. And I think this is a way to help counter misinformation that we see so prevalent in the world today through scientific, digital, humanistic literacies. There's many of us have definitions related to literacies. We have scientific literacies. The previous slide, I talked about technological literacies. These are all important for students to develop in a critical way in order to address the concerns that we have. So finally, in terms of teaching, my next slide has a couple of implications that I think we need to think about in terms of our own teaching. And I begin with the idea of collaboration. So teachers, students, the community. And as I said earlier, I think some of these issues I'm talking about are trends that have begun. So I think we're moving to a new paradigm along these directions. And one is that education and teaching is a collaborative idea. We as teachers, we're not the experts anymore. We're the facilitators of learning. So again, my next point relates to the holistic nature of education. Thank you. My next point, not my next slide. No, sorry, my next point. So if we go back again, we need to respect the wholeness of students. So that's why schools are concerned with health, nutrition, social services, mental health, special learning for learning needs, for students who have particular learning needs. It's appropriate that schools address these areas because we're educating the whole person. We're looking at the development of the complete individual. So in our teaching, we need to somehow personalize the learning so that for students it's authentic and it's relevant. I mentioned this before, but in terms of teaching, I think it's an important factor as well. And authenticity and relevance, we may think about like global issues, for example, are certainly authentic and relevant, but whether students see them as that is a question a teacher has. Do our students recognize that solving global environmental issues is authentic and relevant to them? And if it's not, then it's the role of the teacher to get the student to the point where they realize that what we want them to do is important to them. And finally, in terms of our teaching, I think teachers need to be given respect, trust, and autonomy. And this is something that's disappeared from the teaching profession over a long period of time, as I alluded to before with the sort of neoliberal focus on the need to assess everything has diminished the authority of the teacher. I think we're teachers, we're the experts. We know how our students are going, and education authorities need to come to the point of respecting and valuing teachers' judgments because we're the experts. Okay, my next slide, finally, I just want to look at what I perceive is some of the limitations relating to these new trends in education and the continuation of these trends. So I summarize these in my next slide. In many countries, I think university entrance is a limitation on what we can do in secondary schools. Many students aspire to continue to university after school. And so in a sense, teachers are bound by the university prerequisites for particular courses. This is an impediment, I think, to the good work that we could be doing in education. And if we look at teacher entry, so students going into teacher education programs at university, the same thing applies. In Australia, we have all our secondary examination students have an examination score that they get at the end of their secondary schooling, and that score determines what university courses they can go in. So it may be that you need a score of more than 70 to go into teaching. You need a score of more than 90 to go into dentistry, and so on. And I know many countries have a similar arrangement. Fortunately, universities are increasingly looking at alternative entry by portfolio, entry by interview, and the evidence seems to be that students who enter teacher education through alternate routes are just as good, if not better, teachers than those who enter with an end of secondary examination score. So this is a trend that maybe will become more flexible. I alluded earlier to the discipline structures and the need for interdisciplinarity. Over the years, of course, there have been many calls for interdisciplinarity within education, but the disciplines are so strong that they remain. So again, this is not going to be a revolutionary change, but an evolutionary change. And I think STEM, maybe is one aspect that's heading in this direction. And finally, I think, and this is quite a personal perspective, some of the compliance requirements that we have in teacher education limit our opportunity to be innovative. So, for example, if you go to the next slide, this is what all students in Australia have to provide evidence of before they can get a job as a teacher. They have to provide evidence that they have achieved all of these standards. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have standards. I think that's important, particularly in teacher education, but addressing this kind of rigorous compliance becomes an impediment to diversity. The next slide is another indicator along the same lines. So in Australia, every university that wants to train teachers has to provide evidence that their teacher education program has met these national standards. And we spend so much time documenting this, time which we could better spend being more innovative in our education. So I know that's kind of a negative point to conclude on, but I think we need to recognize the limitations to being innovative and working towards new paradigms. So my final slide is a summary. I think there's ample rationales that we need to be doing something different in education. It's incremental rather than radical. So I think we have begun this movement. Many of our pedagogies reflect these kinds of trends, but it's something we need to keep focusing on in order to deliver the best type of education for the world that we live in this day and age. So my next slide just simply says, thank you for the opportunity to chat with you today. I've spoken for longer than I had intended. I'm sorry about that. But as John said, sorry, as Professor Clark said this morning, he was sorry he didn't speak for longer because he got too many good questions. So I took his advice in my presentation. But I'm happy if anyone wants to put questions in the chat. These questions can be sent to me and I'm happy to answer them and then return them, and they can go on the website. So if you want to cease sharing that now, thank you.
Yes, everyone, if you have questions, feel free to send your questions to the chat box. Okay. And so far, our times is we have to go for the next activity, and the knowledge and the issue that Professor John Graham just presented to us in the new paradigms about the three perspectives about the pedagogy, curriculum, and teaching would give us a good information and ideas about what we should be concerned, and for now and for sure in the future. And as a representative of the Faculty of Education, Ksat Sat University, and all the audience, I would like to thank you, Dr. Williams, for your presentation. And okay, so I think we're gonna move on, and for the next session, as we said, it's gonna be the parallel session, and we still welcome the questions, and we will send the question to Professor Williams.
Okay, thank you again. I'm sorry I spoke for too long, but I'm very happy to answer your questions, and I look forward to meeting you maybe in some conferences later in the year. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Williams. I am concluded your questions for you and we'll send you the email, and all the questions that be answered from you will be posted on the website as well as Dr. Clark. And I have another announcement that I just got from personally. Dr. Clark has just sent us his presentation for this morning. We will also post that on the website as well. But right now it's not already available. So please be patient with us. Once it's already available, we'll make another announcement. Okay. Thank you so much. And please go to your parallel sessions, and you will go into any of the sessions that interest you. In the morning, we have a little bit of a technological glitch. We have a lot of people going into one room only. So if you kindly spread into all 4 rooms, that would encourage our presenters very well. And then don't forget to come back. We have another interesting activity which 4 of our panelists are waiting for you, and they are very excited. Please come back and we will see you soon. Thank you kindly. Bye for now.
Thank you, John.
Yep, see you soon. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Good to see you.